Well, thank you everyone for clicking on to watch this video. We're going to talk a little bit about the use of the word cult to describe um, high control religious groups, specifically the 2x2 group. Um, I left that group after spending my life in it about a year and a half ago. And since then, many of us in trying to process our experience, and we've talked about a lot about is this specific church a cult or not? And I'm involved in helping with an online platform, and we've had quite a discussion on there if we should allow the use of the word cult to describe the 2x2 church. And the reason behind that discussion is because it's such an offensive word, and it is a real turnoff for some people, and drive people away from the platform. So we'd had some discussion on there, and then I told my wife Jody, who's joining me today, about this conversation and asked her thoughts on allowing the use of the word cult. And she took the conversation, because of her background and training, she took the conversation in a direction that was unexpected to me, but I found very helpful. So, yeah, Jody, would you mind sharing your thoughts about when I asked you that, presented that to you?
Yeah, I think there were two parts of it, and maybe I'll just mention both briefly. One thing I think my immediate, like automatic response almost was to say that it's more kind or generous or less stereotyping or something to say something along the lines of this behavior is cult-like behavior. So kind of being really specific rather than throwing out the word cult for an entire group. One of my reasons for that is when I teach religion courses, I've noticed that it can be really painful when one student blurts out about a group that they know very little about, that, well, that's a cult. Um, you're asking about the use of the term within a group, perhaps from people who know quite a bit about it, right? But they all still might have different reasons for drawing on that terminology. And so I think using the phrase cult-like behavior invites a bit more like precision, so you know what someone is referring to when they use the word. Um, but personally, when you asked that, the thing that came into my awareness almost immediately was just a curiosity about my own encounter with the word over the course of I've spent my life embedded in the Seventh-day Adventist community. And so that involved for me going to Bible classes when I was in high school, and then I studied to be a minister in college, and so studied multiple years of theology. And in both high school and college, this conversation came up, are Seventh-day Adventists categorized as a cult? And the interesting thing that I became aware of in our conversation was that I can look back on those conversations, and they often centered on how to prove to someone that Seventh-day Adventists were not a cult. So we would look at the list of kind of, I don't know, qualifications. What makes something a cult? How many of these things have to be true about a group, et cetera, et cetera? How does one scholar define a cult? And then we would have our conversation centering around all the aspects of the truth about us and our group and the history of our group, et cetera, that proved that we did not qualify as a cult. And I think what I find interesting about that is that now, as someone who studies like healing from spiritual abuse and religious trauma, um, the purpose of any conversation about cult groups, about the types of behaviors that take place in cult groups, the purpose of it is to learn how to identify. I would argue the purpose is to learn how to identify misuse of power. So be aware of power dynamics, be aware of when power is being misused, and what the options are for setting appropriate boundaries and for expressing needs and adjusting, as you know what I mean, as you go along, for setting up accountability, et cetera. And so I find it really interesting that in my entire life in this community, I never had any opportunities to talk about power and how to use it appropriately. I mean, I suppose power in itself is a neutral category. It's an automatic part of human life, but how to use it appropriately, how to be mindful of how it's affecting people. Um, and yeah, so that's the takeaway for me from our conversation from a few months ago, was just realizing that I would have found it really helpful to have conversations about power and control.
Yeah, there's two things, maybe three things that stand out to me in that. The one is the value of conversation rather than um, adamant statements. The second is I believe that any of us who have left the church have legitimate reasons to be upset with the church and our experience in the church. We also have legitimate reasons to be grateful and much other. It's very nuanced, but so, and there is a certain satisfaction in just saying it is a cult. And that can be I don't know, what do you say, cathartic in a way. It can also bring clarity. It's not a there's advantages to it, to just a clear, simple answer like that. But there's also some limitations. And one thing we've talked about in our group is thought stopping cliches. Like,
Hmm.
you just have this statement that you make, like, well, God is in control, and so you don't really have to examine poor behavior of church leaders, or there's lots of those. But I what the first thing, what I remember when we first had this conversation several months ago is, like, yeah, calling the church a cult can really easily be a kind of a thought stopping statement. And
Yeah.
I like the idea of, I'm not against calling it a cult. I have called it a cult in public. But I like the idea of, in addition to the simple answer, looking for more nuanced, complex things that actually cause us to look into what you're saying.
Yeah, into like, yeah, to continue a conversation, to stay in connection with other people, with awareness of the history of our kind of faith. I don't faith ancestry. Can we say that? Like the community that has shaped us, the history of that movement, and stay in dialogue with people who are bringing up the conversation, whether in our case, decades ago, it was a conversation between people in the wider evangelical world who were saying Seventh Day Adventists are a cult, and here are the reasons, and then others who would say no. Um, but I like your point that the purpose again of these conversations is the dialogue. We learn, we clarify our own understanding in the process of articulating, asking for clarification, staying connected. And so if it can be a way to stay in the conversation and seek clarity, seek understanding, further understanding of others who we may not really fully understand, um, then it can be a helpful conversation. But I think in many cases when we automatically, like if you throw the term out as a blanket statement, I think it automatically puts defenses up, like whoop, a wall goes up.
Yeah, and I think I'm going more with the internal exploration and dialogue.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, but I can say it is a cult, and then I don't have to think anymore about my own experience in it.
Yeah, so and that's fascinating, because then if I'm saying for me right now in this season of my life, the purpose of these conversations is clarity and discernment around use of power. Um and so in that case, even within our own self-reflection, to stay engaged and to say, like, what has been really meaningful to me? Where do I need to set different boundaries or engage in a different way that's more sustainable? Um Even if
Mhm.
you think of it as an awareness of an internal conversation, it still invites this ongoing process rather than a closed
Yeah.
end of conversation, no more need to engage.
And what I remember now, when in our original conversation, was I'll put this in my own words, something I remember, a concept that you were trying to express, I believe, is rather than somebody on the online platform saying the 2x2 church is a cult, write it out. The 2x2 church abused power, misused the 2x2 church did this to me in my life. Rather than one sentence, have a thinking process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think another thing that's come up in the conversations you and I have had, that I'm still seeking clarity on this myself, but it can be really helpful to just explore power and control dynamics.
Mhm.
And I think it's easy for me right now in my life to kind of almost leave the conversation, or like get intimidated by the conversation, and I kind of back away by saying, well, power is inherently neutral. It can look different ways. Maybe we're constantly adjusting, how we set boundaries, how we make sense of the use of power in various groups that we're part of. But I think it can also be helpful to ground our thinking in really concrete things. Like, I'll just give you a couple of examples that have helped me when I feel like my mind is swimming. I'm going in every possible direction and I've kind of lost my tether. um One is, it's been helpful to me to look at the work of people like Judith Herman, who is really well known for decades ago doing groundbreaking research in trauma and recovery. And she came out with a book recently. I think it's called Truth and Repair. But anyway, she highlights the work in the field of domestic violence specifically, but she talks about how, like, you can look up a power and control wheel. It's a very simplified kind of summary of the most common ways that tyranny, she uses the word tyranny, so sort of tyranny where you do just enough to get control and then just enough to keep that control. And then she has also another graphic that is like a equality wheel, maybe. I don't remember the term, but basically she allows you to like look at the two, and she points out that some of the dynamics that exist in abusive relationships are the same exact dynamics that are used in war, in other situations that are on a totally different scale, like national versus individual relationship, but the mechanisms of misuse of control are the same. And so that's been really helpful to me to go back to that research that's been done by people over many decades, and to say, no, there are like very concrete things that we can point to that come up over and over and over in studies of this. And then another thing that's been helpful to me is just to look at, like, rather than saying, okay, these are all the things that are not working for me, and I'm gonna, like, react to each one of those, to actually study, what do healthy relationships look like? Like, read up on resources about healthy relationship with oneself, with one's family members, with in group dynamics. Anyway, those two things have kind of helped to anchor me when I start to feel like I'm floating in every single direction when I enter these sorts of conversations.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for
Welcome.
joining me for this conversation. Thanks for all the work you've done to be informed and educated on these matters.